class. So the topic for this week's discussion will be Canada's Indigenous people. So of course the topic of Indigenous people, their history, and like their current treatment and their integration within modern society is something that doesn't just affect Canada, right? There are Indigenous people living all across the world, Australia and New Zealand, for example, in America, in Europe. But for today's purposes, we're going to focus on our discussion on Canada's Indigenous people, which is, I think, a topic that a lot of us should have a lot of prior knowledge to, but it's also a topic that I think, is relevant to today's news and politics. So maybe what we'll start off with is just briefly talking about the history. Maybe I'll get you guys to explain what you guys know about it, make sure everyone's on the same page, and then we can move into some more critical discussion and analysis of, today's society's treatment of Indigenous people, what kind of solutions, society is currently looking at to try to rectify for past mistakes, and what are some current struggles that these communities still face? How can we give them more representation and kind of take steps to make sure that they're better able to integrate into Canadian society? Okay. So let's start with the history of Indigenous people in Canada. Does anyone want to volunteer? Just maybe like give a summary of what they know or what they've learned in their school about the history of Indigenous people in Canada. Anyone? Okay. Well, oh, someone's in the waiting room. We probably let them in. Okay. Let's see. What about you? How about you start us off? Tell us what you know.
There's a lot of different groups of Indigenous people in Canada, such as the Métis, Anishinaabe, Nisaga.
Okay,
Yep.
for sure. Anything else? Anyone know why there are so many different groups? Um, Grace, what do you think?
Um, I don't know, I'm just taking a guess, but like uh maybe just because like for some reason like the people split up and like wanted like independent tribes or something.
Yeah, so like historically, because Canada is such like a large country, right? There were many different groups, or we could say like tribes, I guess, even of Indigenous people living in Canada before the European settlers actually came. And all of these had their own separate, distinct communities, their separate, distinct cultures and spirituality. So they were kind of like distinct, self-functioning, like autonomous groups that were living in these areas. But that significantly changed, once the settlers did come in. We'll probably talk more about that in the actual kind of when we talk about the history. But good. Let's hear from one more person. So, Hebe, I know you just joined, but we're basically talking about Canada's Indigenous people. And right now we're kind of just starting off by discussing the history of it. So, is there anything that you know from your personal knowledge or from school that about the history?
Um, I think the majority of them like live on reservations.
Hmm.
Uh,
And what are reservations?
it's just like a community that's like separated from like big cities and stuff, where it's mostly just Native American people living there.
Hmm. Good. And do you know broadly the reason why most Indigenous people live on reserves?
Not really.
Okay. It's fair enough. I think that's all good context. I think the general like overarching idea is the idea of colonialism, right? And how like hundreds of years ago, before European settlers came and discovered the New World, which were the Americas, right? That there were these indigenous people that first lived in Canada. They lived in many separate tribes or communities, like Bessie told us. And of course, it wasn't like, perfect peace or harmony, right? Like, of course, they started conflicts with each other, but they had communities for the most part. They were self-sufficient, they were autonomous, and they were able to go about their daily lives. And of course, after that first contact was made, and you introduce these kind of like foreign communities, these settlers, there's generally a lot of the things we learn about colonialism and how it led to the exploitation of indigenous people, how it increased the amount of violence and abuse, and overall, I think just the subjugation of these indigenous people that were a lot less technologically advanced than the settlers, who were able to kind of use their power and their dominance to kind of take over most of the land of Canada to set up their own communities. And as a result of that, the indigenous people were relegated into their separate, like smaller communities that they had to live in, right? So it was like, yes, they agreed to kind of live in these smaller communities far away from the rest of civilization. But in reality, it was more so like they were forced to do so, right? It was like they were being violently threatened, and the only alternative for them was to kind of separate themselves from the rest of society in order to preserve their culture while, not having their entire civilization be destroyed by these really, really, at the time, powerful European settlers. So that's broadly like the idea of, or the effect of colonialism onto the indigenous people. So let's have a brief discussion on colonialism and its roots. Why was this such a big issue? Like, why didn't the European settlers, when they came to the New World, when they came to the Americas, just decide, let's live and cooperate and live in harmony with these indigenous people? Why did they react so violently? Why did they try to subjugate these indigenous people? Why did they kind of force them to give up most of their land and for them to settle there instead? What do you guys think? Grace.
I'm still taking a guess, but maybe because they would have thought that maybe peacefully talking it out wouldn't work well for them. So they decided to like instead just like choose war over peacefully like trying to take over the land.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good guess. It's like it's easier to get what you want if you can forcefully threaten someone else to give it up for you, right? Like if they tried to peacefully negotiate with the indigenous people, like maybe they'd be able to trade with them and maybe they get like their fabrics or their furs or their native fruits and things like that. But given that the settlers actually had a lot more advanced weapons and technology, like you can see in the picture, they have literal ships and swords and things like that, right? And like guns and things like that, right? It's far easier for them to take more of the indigenous people's resources by just physically threatening them or like killing them, or, yeah, attacking them. So that's for sure one reason why this power imbalance, right? One side being far more powerful than the other, incentivizes that more powerful side to just violently attack and to threaten the kind of indigenous people and take over their resources, their people, their land. So yeah, that's a very common theme in colonialism. Anyone else? Okay, let's hear from Lucas. What do you think?
What is the question we're trying to answer?
So like, what do you think were the main causes for this colonialism against like indigenous people?
They just, I guess they saw the resources that they had, and well, back in Europe, they didn't have as much like land for these trees, like materials. So, I mean, for to the Europeans, I guess it was free for the taking.
Yeah, also a great explanation. So many of the European settlers that actually came to these new lands, right? Their trips, their expeditions were funded either by the government, the European governments, or the church, right? So the church was a really dominant institution, like back in the days, right? And so they really had to, come to this new world with a point to prove, and they had to come back with trade routes, with new resources to kind of like justify to the government or the church that, hey, you guys spending all that money funding our trip, all of that was worth it. And so, please keep giving us more money so we can come back here and get more resources for you guys. So I think for sure part of that was being able to extract the resources, to take the resources from the New World and bring it back to Europe for the benefit of the Europeans. Now, um, okay, maybe we'll hear from one more person. Alina, what do you, Alina, are you there? Okay, Grace, what do you think? Did I call on you already? I don't know. Oh, you probably did you raise your hand? I forget. Maybe do Bessie then.
Uh, Wait, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so what do you think were the main causes for the colonialism against this indigenous people?
Oh, land. Probably a lot of they want to expand their agriculture and also having colonizing the lands that indigenous people run would give them a lot of resources that they could also send back to like their country for money and stuff.
Okay, yeah, so this is very similar to what other people have said, but yeah, for sure the land as well, a very valuable resource. You can like set up your own civilizations. You can set up factories to cut down the trees, to hunt beavers and to get their fur and things like that, right? To set up farms so you can grow more food. So land, of course, is very, very valuable. But I think what we've mostly discussed so far has been focused on like the material benefits of colonialism, right? We're getting resources, you can get stuff that you can sell for money, you can get land, but I think there's a whole other part of colonialism that, or the cause of colonialism that we haven't really discussed yet, which is kind of like the human aspect of it, right? So, what do you guys think justified these Europeans, mostly white settlers, treatment of indigenous people? Like a very, very violent and abusive treatment of indigenous people. What do you think justified that, like in their Kiwi? What do you think?
Like racism, because
Hmm.
like even like not just in North America, colonialism was justified by using like race and like the cultural practices of these other like civilizations to justify like like war with them and also like slavery and stuff.
Okay, yeah, for sure. So racism for sure, and this looks like the discrimination, right, of one group of people, right, of similar characteristics, like visual characteristics, against another of like different visual traits, right? And this is something that we observe throughout course of human history. Of course, it's not just the treatment of indigenous people. We see racism all the time. It still persists in today's society. But for sure, right, just like the mere appearance and the existence of another group that looks different from you might make you react in like a more cautious way oftentimes. But in the case of the settlers, it kind of mm, like in their eyes, it seemed like they were kind of a threat, right? It seemed like there was someone different, that they weren't part of civilization necessarily. And this was amplified by the fact that they were a lot less technologically advanced compared to the settlers, right? So again, looking back to the image on the slide, you can see that their clothing is a lot different. It seems a lot more primitive. types of tools and technologies that they have. The fact that you don't really see any buildings or anything, right? They're just kind of hunting, living this like self-sufficient hunter-gatherer lifestyle, right? And so all of those traits put together in the eyes of the European settlers made it seem like the indigenous people were very uncivilized and cultured. And so they were not worthy of very good treatment, right? They were maybe not seen as humans, but rather savages and things like that. And another factor I will note, again, this is like going back to like the Middle Ages, right? Again, religion had a big role in society in those sorts of times, and very religious. The settlers who were European and really religious believed that it was kind of like their divine mission, right, from God to kind of colonize this sort of land, to take it from these less civilized, less sophisticated group of indigenous people, and to claim it for themselves so that they can build their society that's like mandated by God or something like that. So these are important factors for us to understand historically why this mistreatment and why this colonialism against indigenous people was perpetuated, right? So, what did this then lead to? So, as more and more European settlers arrived at the shores of North America, so Canada, example, and they started, setting up their own civilizations. Gradually, they expanded across South Canada and they consolidated more and more power to the point where, um, you know, even the governments, like the European governments, got involved and started partitioning up the land, Canadian land, for the Europeans. So there were many, many acts that were actually implemented that basically gave the Europeans like a legal right to own the land, to basically to formalize, legalize things like discrimination against indigenous people who they had a derogatory term for were the Indians, right? So these sorts of acts, put into law the ability for these European settlers and the civilizations to basically, be seen as superior and to gain all the societal benefits of being seen as superior compared to the indigenous people living in those times. We already talked about why they wanted more land. So what ended up happening as a result of this colonialism and the effects of which still continue today was a treaty system that was set up as the settlers conquered more and more Canadian land, right? And they basically forced all these indigenous groups, these various tribes into submission. They basically forced them to sign very, very unjust and unequal treaties that would force them to give up a lot of the land that they had traditionally lived on, and instead made them agree to live in these like tinily partitioned treaty areas very far away, very far to the north and away from the rest of civilization. So in total, I think, I don't know, there were like 11 or something treaties that were signed, right? That basically pushed all of these various indigenous groups and tribes all the way up into like the northern parts of Canada to where their descendants still live today. And that's basically the short explanation of how or why the indigenous reserves, where indigenous reserves are located today and why they came to exist. Okay. I do also want to briefly talk about a really, really, I think, unfortunate part of the colonial legacy, which were residential schools. Does anyone actually know anything about residential schools uh, in Canada for Indigenous people? Great.
It's supposedly for like all the indigenous kids. I think the Europeans set it up to like make the indigenous kids what they think was like they tried to make like the indigenous kids like become one of like do the European ways and like learn the European things instead of following their traditions.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good summary of what they are, right? So they set up schools for these indigenous kids, and they're not the schools that we conceptualize today, where it's like, oh, you go to school and you do your homework and you learn your like math and English and stuff like that, you go home. these schools were highly religious. So the religion, like the cat, what do you call it? Like the Christianity was very, very integrated into everyday school life. So you can see literally in that picture, there's a picture of the nun in the background of that of the classroom, right? So religion was heavily involved in every part of these indigenous children's school day-to-day life. So they lived in these sorts of schools. They were boarding schools as well, right? So whereas me and you, we go to school and we come back home every single day, the indigenous children, and this is also a very unfortunate part of it, they were taken away from their parents, most of them, when they lived on the reserves, right? They were taken away from their parents on those reserves, and they were forcibly put into these residential schools where they would spend the next, I don't know, 12 years of their life. Um, and as Grace said, the point of these schools was to basically indoctrinate, right? To forcibly change and make these children adopt a more European or Western style of living. So that involved everything from changing their language from their indigenous native languages to only being forced to speak in English. It looked like forcing them to adopt new names, names that were like, Christian, Western, European names. They had to also convert their religion from, their indigenous spiritual religion or whatever, right, to Catholicism or Christianity. And there were very harsh punishments for children that refused to do these sorts of things. So it was cultural erasure. It was the taking away of their indigenous culture, and like the term that you would call it now is like assimilation, right? It was forcible assimilation of these indigenous children into European or Western society against their will. This is very, very traumatic, and yeah, I think it's a very unfortunate part of Canada's Indigenous legacy that we look very poorly upon today. But back in the day, and note this was like it's very recent, this continued until very recently. So like even in the 1990s, residential schools still existed. Um, a lot of people in society saw it as not a big issue, right? Because it just seemed normal to them. It seemed like part of everyday life, that it was actually a lot of people believe it was good that we were assimilating these indigenous people to try to, make them into normal members of society. But obviously, this was a very immoral kind of action that the Canadian government supported. Okay, hopefully that gives a bit of context onto that. So, I do also want to discuss the impacts of residential schools. I think based on what I've told you, or maybe from what you also learned in school, what do you think were the impacts of these residential schools onto children, Indigenous children? Andrew?
Uh, they lost like heritage and they lost like traditional teaching, recipes, stuff like that. They also just didn't feel right when they were around their parents and friends. Um, and then they also weren't used to the indigenous way of life because they didn't learn it.
Yeah, for sure. So all of those things are true, right? I think the biggest impact this had on these kids is it really destroyed that connection that they had to their culture, to their friends and family that still retained that indigenous culture, and it forced them to adopt, basically against their will, this completely foreign culture to them, right? It's like if you and I were basically taken from our homes, our houses, or apartments, or wherever we live, and let's say we were transported hundreds of kilometers away to a school in a completely different region of Ontario, right? And they basically told us you had to now learn a completely different language. You have to believe in a completely different religious framework that you didn't believe in before. Um, and you had to do these completely random traditions and customs that you had never done a day in your life before. It would be a really, really scary, confusing, and traumatic experience for a lot of us. So I think we cannot discount the impact of that. It's a really, really big impact. Anyone else? Phoebe, what do you?
The children are also abused while they were at the schools by the teachers and stuff. Like they were like beat, and also a lot of them died, and that also creates like generational trauma from when they left the schools and affected like their children and their grandchildren and stuff. And there are really high rates of like alcoholism and drug abuse within indigenous communities.
Yeah, very good. So this is the other thing I wanted to talk about is that apart from the cultural effects, I think the personal effects these children had it when they experienced when they were in these residential schools, scarring for a lifetime for them, but also the generational trauma that then passed down to their children via effects like, for example, um, a lot of these children after leaving these schools, they had to turn to things like drug addictions or alcohol to try to cope with the trauma that they had experienced, right? Or it might have just led them to be unwilling to engage with the rest of society because of the abuse, like even physical abuse or even sexual abuse at times, right? Which was really, really common in these residential schools. That meant, they were very likely to end up on the streets, to be unemployed or homeless, and that made it really difficult for them to be able to raise a future family, for things like them to be able to get a job, to be able to have like a financially stable life. Um, so I would say, in addition to the way these schools were designed, they were just really, really poorly run in practice. So a lot of people, a lot of children unfortunately died, like Hebe said. A lot of them also just yeah, they were, even if they didn't die, they were oftentimes physically or mentally scarred for life. And that's a, very unfortunate part of this legacy again. Um, but yeah, it's good that you guys recognize that. I know this is a bit of a, maybe more of a heavier topic, but I think it's important for us to discuss this. Now, one of the more modern, like, kind of news pieces, recent news pieces that came out is kind of the discovery of mass graves at these sorts of residential schools, where it's actually revealed that hundreds of indigenous children who had died, passed away in their time at these residential schools, were basically buried by the school or the government underneath the schools, right? So, like, apart from the fact that, families were never notified that their children had died and they just had buried them en masse underneath the schools, right? The fact that so many children had died in this news getting out to the public was really, really shocking. And I think it did set off a lot of shockwaves within Canadian society and then led more people to push for kind of justice and accountability for the people, for the government, who had, for the most part, supported and again perpetuated this sort of behavior or these sorts of schools. Okay, so I want us now to kind of discuss, before we get into the current issues, just to kind of wrap up this discussion on residential schools and the historical abuses against these indigenous people. How do we think, or I guess, what are some ways the government of Canada, what are some things the government of Canada can do to try to help society move on and heal, but also to get, justice and accountability for their actions in the past that have harmed a lot of these people. Anyone? Okay, Andrew says they should say sorry. And I actually think so. I mean, yeah, I understand this is more so with a humorous intent, but I genuinely do think like the very act of just apologizing is something that needs to be formally done and should be done to these indigenous people, right? It's a first step in acknowledging that these abuses did happen in the first place, that like on a national level, right? Hundreds of these residential schools were set up and thousands of indigenous children were forcibly placed here, and cultures were erased, their lives were ruined, right? So the first step in actually admitting, hey, we messed up um, back then, and we apologize. We take responsibility for the abuses that were done to you is A, incredibly validating to the victims of these sorts of abuses. It basically tells them, hey, the government recognizes that your experience is valid. It isn't something that you just made up and lied or anything like that. It is something that did truly happen. But it then sets up the next steps to actually get, other forms of reparations, other forms of con- con- cons- uh, comp- compensation or actions to help these victims move on, right? Or to help these communities move on. So I think an apology is a really important first step, and we did see this with Stephen Harper's government, um, had a formal apology to Indigenous people, and then Justin Trudeau, the current government, Trudeau also issued a formal apology to these Indigenous groups. So very important for the federal government to do this. Also, provincial governments should do it, in my opinion, as well. Well, anyone else? What other suggestions do we have? One more person, when we can move on. Like, I just want you guys to be able to consider this issue, like give some suggestion of what we can do to address it. Bessie?
Uh, since a lot of indigenous populations are currently in reserves with really poor living circumstances, the government can maybe try to find a solution for those circumstances because currently, if I remember correctly, a lot of reserves don't have proper drinking water, and it's just not a very good standard of living.
Absolutely. That's a good point, right? Like, some of these indigenous people still continue to live on these reserves. Many of them went to residential schools and, graduated and went back to their reserves. So these are people that definitely need that help. These reserves are, as you say, they're underfunded. A lot of them lack clean drinking water. They have to actually boil their drinking water in many cases, boil their water in many cases to make it like safe for drinking, right? They don't have sufficient like maybe healthcare services or even schools in those reserves. It takes days and days for new supplies and things to arrive because it's so far away from society, right? So I think there's just a lot more the government can do to invest in these reserves to improve the quality of life for these indigenous people. And one more thing, I think just for in considering indigenous people who do then choose to reintegrate back into society, who choose to go back into society or like major cities, for example, how can the government help them, right? Being able to improve, for example, the foster childcare system for Indigenous people that are in need of adoption or a foster home, right? To improve on, offering things like, services for people with drug addictions or alcoholism or homeless people. So a lot of them are Indigenous people that end up on the streets as a result of the harms they've suffered in the past in these residential schools, right? So the government recognizing, you know, residential schools were an issue that have caused a lot of the problems we still see in society today for these Indigenous people and being willing to invest money and time and effort into addressing those issues. So broadly, I think those are some of the things that can be done or steps that can be taken. Okay, I want us to now kind of pivot into discussing some current issues that are affecting Indigenous people. And I could sit here and again give you guys a long lecture about all the different social, political, cultural, economic issues that Indigenous people are facing in Canada today. But let's leave it up to you guys, and I'll expand the scope of this research activity to also include any other part of the world. So it's not just limited to Canada. You can use any of the topics we've discussed currently, like the treaty system, the reserves, the residential schools, um, conflict and violence against Indigenous people, or you can choose your own topic. And then four things I just want you guys to note down in your research, which we will share afterwards. Who does this issue affect, right? Like what specific Indigenous group does it affect? Does it affect any other groups in society? How long has this issue lasted for? So to give me a brief timeline. Three, why is this issue actually important or significant? So what are the harms, right, or potential benefits if it's like positive thing that people are doing? And D, what causes issue and what are possible solutions or ways that, the government or people in a country can address this to make it better? Okay. If you guys have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat or unmute right now. Otherwise, I will give you guys, let's say 4 minutes, to do your research. You can use any internet source. I don't really care if you use like AI or anything, because I think, AI is actually useful to give you like information or summaries on like general knowledge issues. So yeah, we'll take 4 minutes, come back, get everyone to share, and then we will do the last thing for today's class, which is just a wrap up discussion. All right, guys, so that was 4 minutes. We're gonna come back and get everyone to share. Does anyone want to volunteer to go first? Okay, I'll just take someone off this randomly. Lucas, how about you get us started?
I didn't manage to finish, but
Okay, that's
um,
fine.
so I was like researching some social issues, and like one of the social issues was hold on, like the indigenous people, they face like unemployment and like um like financial issues because of that.
Okay. So what specifically were the causes and what were the financial issues they faced as a result of that unemployment?
Um, they weren't able to like afford houses and rent, so they were likely to become homeless. And I'm, I think these issues were probably a result of like residential schools because they had like faced drug abuse.
Yeah, for sure. So, mhm, mhm. Good. Okay. Maybe I should have given you guys a bit more time to do your research. But that's okay. That's a good start. Andrew, do you want to go next?
They don't really have much of like a political voice or something because they're like their population isn't as much as the rest of Canada. It's quite small because of all the past stuff. Uh, so a lot of the government don't do much with them. They don't really help them too much because it won't help them win their elections more than if they help citizens of Canada.
Yeah, I think what you described there is actually one of the biggest political issues, right? There are a lot of things that the government can probably do to help Indigenous people, right? But often this requires a lot of money to be invested. It requires hiring a lot of people to actually get these projects done for them, for example. And the problem is, it's just that there are not enough Indigenous people in the population of Canada for them to have a meaningful impact vote, right? And so, you know, they are a minority group, which means it's very difficult for them to be represented. Um, and the government would rather spend all that money and the time and the effort into other issues that greater amounts of people in the population necessarily care about. So therefore, there is a lack of political representation there, and that's a really big problem. Yeah, so that's a really good point. Anyone else want to volunteer? I'm just going to call on someone. Okay, Bessie, let's hear from you.
I chose unemployment as well. Um,
Okay, is there anything you want to add to what Lucas has already said?
yeah, I mean, he said like the poor education quality, which perpetuates their standard of living because they don't get like high paying jobs, which means that they can't afford nicer utilities. Uh, which also means they might not be able to move out of the reserves, which continues the cycle. The way to solve it could be to better fund reserve education as well as help Indigenous people, like provide services or support to Indigenous people to help them find education and new opportunities.
For sure, it's a good point. So I really like how you brought up a solution there. Some other factors actually for unemployment, right? So it's partially a lack of education, but it's also partially, the effect of them having to turn to other sorts of ways in order to cope or to deal with the trauma um, of residential schools, right? And these are often very dangerous things like crime or alcoholism or drug abuse. And, these histories often make it very difficult for them to be able to find jobs, right? So indigenous people, for example, in Canada are actually one of the, like they have the highest proportion of incarceration actually compared to other populations, which means that, if you have a criminal record on you and you go to apply for a job, it's actually a lot harder for an employer to be willing to hire you, right? So that makes it a lot more difficult for them to get a job, even if they are educated, because, you know, unfortunately, crime is something that's still very heavily stigmatized and frowned upon in society, right? So yeah, those are just some additional things I think are worth mentioning there. Okay, good. Who's next? Let's go to Lena. Lena, perfect.
So I did mine on something similar, just like money issues. So some of the main issues that the First Nations people face is that they're heavily discriminated against because even though a lot of people know that First Nations aren't like bad people, it's still hard to accept them because they're still like different from us. And many First Nation people, they are taught differently, and like the things they learn might be different from all of us. And plus, like the most of them live on reserve lands, which means like if they want to go somewhere else to expand like a business or something, they'll have to travel a lot, or they'll be away from a lot of family members. And this has lasted for like a long, long time before any of us has been born. Like the ever since the Europeans came to Canada, they've been limiting the First Nations growth economically because they really just like give the First Nations like the like they try to get most of the deals from themselves, and acts like the Indian Act, like they restricted a lot of the opportunities the First Nations could have had because it like just took away a lot of their freedom. And this is really important mainly because First Nations are like people as well, and they're really important part of Canada's history, and a lot of people don't recognize them enough. And just like any other people out there, but like they still suffer a lot. Even if on the reserve lands, they might not live as great of a life as all of us. And a lot of these things are caused by like stuff like the Indian Act and residential schools, which like cause a lot of trauma. And a lot of people will hire indigenous people because that they think like the indigenous people are like they can do less than other people. So a lot of the solutions is like a lot of things like they self-govern the land, a piece of the land has already been implemented and it has been quite successful. And then like building roads or giving sources of electricity or other necessities could like also help like the economic growth, and like just trying to just overall ending this discrimination against them can also help them a lot.
Yeah, so fantastic work with your research, Alina. I like how you covered a wide range of societal issues that you then tie to financial the financial issues that First Nations, Indigenous people are facing, and you also talk about some solutions, which are, I think, great. Okay, let's move on. Try to kind of maybe increase the pace a bit because we are running close to the end of class time. Hebe, do you want to go next?
Okay. I also I didn't get to the last point. So my issue was healthcare on reserves, and this affects just the people living on the reserves, specifically like the elderly, because they have poor health. And it started uh I guess like from the beginning, where like not too much care or funding was put towards like making the reserves like a good place to live. And yeah, so the problem is lack of funding and also lack of people who are willing to work in the reserves. So I think we should like fund them more to build infrastructure and also to reward like either people who grew up outside of the reserves to go onto the reserve to do healthcare, or to reward like kids, like indigenous kids, to grow up and become doctors and then like care for their community. And I didn't get to the last point, so
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. Especially in light of like the COVID epidemic, we actually saw really like, huge inequality and disparity between the amount of like treatment and healthcare opportunities that were being provided to these First Nations. So, like they were a lot less able to get things like vaccines, for example, against COVID. There were just overall less hospitals and less infrastructure available for those who did get infected, right? Which meant you can see like the mortality rate would have been a lot higher because they couldn't get enough like, medical treatment in time. So these are inequalities in healthcare that do affect these indigenous communities quite a lot. Okay, who's the last person that I didn't get to yet? Let's see. Grace, go ahead.
I chose to talk about a cultural issue, which is um the loss of like the preservation and like the preservation of their languages because they're facing the threat of extinction because of like, for example, the wait, what was it? Like the colo hold up colonization of like the European colonization, and for like other like the loss of land and resources. And this started when it was this started ever since like the 15th century, I'm pretty sure. Um so it's really important because of like cultural diversity and cultural identity and like resilience.
Yeah, for sure. And do you think that there are any potential solutions to this that we can try to implement right now?
Maybe like if some people like address it, or like maybe talk to like reporters, or like maybe make it more aware to the public.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess just getting like news coverage and awareness from the media, for example, that this is an issue, right? We could potentially see like with the healthcare issue, right? Maybe we can construct more schools in indigenous reserves. Maybe we can hire teachers who are aware of these indigenous languages, or who still have some understanding and try to be able to pass this down to the next generation of indigenous people, right? This is something that I think would be a good way to counteract the younger generation trying to move away from these reserves and moving back into these cities where they're more likely to assimilate with the rest of society and actually give up their culture and language, right? So yes, maybe you can argue it's a good thing that they're reintegrating back to society, but at the same time, it's important to recognize, are there ways we can preserve their native languages, right, which are really culturally significant to such a huge community of these indigenous people, right? So it could look like setting up records or archives, or even like just preserving literature, like books that were written in these sorts of languages, preserving things like folk tales or cultural traditions, writing that down somewhere, and maybe having the government keep that safe somewhere. So we can document this and have that historical artifact to keep in the future. Cool. I think that's going to be it for today's class. Thank you guys for your participation. You guys had some really good answers to the questions, and you also did some really good work with the research. Sorry we didn't really get to the third part, which I think would have been more so, we could have had a bit more discussion and debate on these contentious issues. So it was more so of like a research and like discussion kind of oriented class. There wasn't as much debate this week, but I still enjoyed all of you guys' contributions, and I hope you guys learned something about Indigenous people in Canada. So yeah, thanks for a great class. If you guys don't have any other questions, you're free to go. Otherwise, yeah, you're free to go. I will. I don't know if yeah. I don't think I'll be here next week, so I'll probably see you guys the week after that. Okay, thanks guys.
Bye.
Bye. Take care. Bye.